working? I think so. Okay. So the first part talks about New France and just gives you a little bit of background in the fact that France had begun to explore North America starting, well, the first actual settlement that they set up was Quebec in 1608. So Quebec and Montreal are the two kind of major settlements that they set up. But even before that, they were exploring the New World and mostly got involved in the fur trade. So what part of the New World are they in, generally speaking? Canada. So what the French figured out is that for them, in order to be successful, they needed to have a decent relationship with the natives. Without the natives helping them as they moved into the interior to find where they could find the beaver and all the different kinds of animals that they were going to get fur from, they were not going to be successful because they didn't come here with thousands and thousands of people and they didn't know the land like the Indians did. So without their help, they probably would not have done well. And the French did well in terms of just working with them and building alliances with them. They also didn't come with any women. So they actually did more, I don't know if it was always an official marriage, but they, in essence, intermarried with the native women and built relationships with those women and those different communities that they encountered. That's not what happened with the English and the Spanish. So if you look at those three major European groups that came to America, the one throughout their history, even going into the period getting close to the Revolutionary War, the European power that has the best relationship with the natives is going to be France through that whole time period. Now, that doesn't mean that every French person was really nice to every Indian and vice versa, but generally speaking.
Well, strategy.
Exactly. And it was mainly, it met their goals and their purposes. They needed them, and it wasn't going to do them any good to antagonize them and then not have them be their guides, not have them help them with food and trading, different things. So it ended up working well for them to do that. So anyway, the first part of the notes focus on a little bit about New France. And you find that they eventually explored all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico by going down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And so the French had staked their claim over this particular century, mostly in Canada, but as they traveled, they always, as all the explorers did, they would claim that land for the king, their king, obviously, as they went through different territories. Holding that land was another story, though. I mean, I can go out in the parking lot and stick a flag in the ground and say, I claim this for somebody, and it doesn't really matter if I can't do anything about actually holding that territory. So even though they had explored the Mississippi River and had claimed the entire valley for France, when it came time to actually have to fight for it, they ran into problems. And that's where the English and the French are going to get into issues with each other, specifically around the Ohio River Valley. Because the English are moving westward from the east coast, and the French are moving southward from up in Canada down the Mississippi, and they're eventually going to start to clash over some of that territory. So we'll talk more about that as time goes on. Keep in mind that the French are also Catholic. Not all the French, because we'll talk at some point about the Huguenots, and those were French Protestants that came over. But for the most part, France is Catholic. And so when they claim this territory, they claim it to be Christian, to be Catholic, and they're not going to allow other religions to operate there. The French also did not encourage self-government. Now, whether or not you encourage self-government doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Or if you don't support it, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. A lot of times when I'm talking about this period in our history, and we talk about how the French and the English and the Spanish and the Dutch and everybody came over from Europe and settled here, they all have connections to their homelands. They all have people that they're still responsible to. The kings are still their bosses, so to speak. They still have to answer to them. But it's kind of like when you have kids that go away to college. I mean, I've had 3 of them well, 2, and 1 who went away and came back. But the first 2 went away and stayed away and actually got a degree. We were paying the bills. In essence, they still had to do what we told them to do, or we could say we're not going to pay the bills anymore. But it's a whole lot tougher to make them do what you want them to do when they live that far away, and when you don't see them every day and you don't know what they're doing day in and day out.
You have to trust what they say.
Or just know that they're lying to you and hope it's not going to get them in too much trouble. But yes, they were still responsible to us, but they could have a whole lot more autonomy and they could do a whole lot more things without really getting into trouble because we weren't going to find out about every little thing they did. So the same thing's going to be true of these explorers and these people that are setting up these communities. In theory, they still have to answer to the authorities back home. But when the authorities back home are 3 months away, in terms of travel, it's going to be real tough for them to really keep them on a short leash. So keep in mind that officially, these people are not here as independent people that have just set up a new nation. They are here as Frenchmen or Englishmen or Spanish, people that that are still answerable to their kings and to the authorities back home. We'll talk more about that. Also, look at the dates that we're talking about here. Go back to if we start with when Columbus discovers America, what year is that?
1492.
1492. The first permanent French settlement is 1608. It's a pretty long period of time. So the French, and then we'll talk about the English as well. The first permanent English settlement is which one?
Was it
Jamestown, which is what year?
1607, I think.
Good, 1607. So English 1607, Quebec 1608. So both of them, as far as their first permanent settlement, are early 1600s, which is a full 100 and some years after Columbus discovered America. What were France and England doing that kept them from exploring when the Spanish and the Portuguese were over here?
They were fighting.
Basically, they had been involved in war with each other. The war had actually ended in the mid-1400s, but then they had to rebuild because they weren't in any position to send out expeditions. They just didn't have the money and the resources at that point to do that. So it took them a while to kind of get back to the place of being able to start to challenge Spain in this particular type of way. So the Spanish get ahead of them and are able to discover the New World, and then, as we've already said, to discover the gold and silver, which was what was bringing an awful lot of wealth back to them. Of course, England and France hear about that, and they want to be able to come over. I mean, supposedly at Jamestown, they actually thought they could just get off the boats and walk around, and the gold would just be sitting there, and you just kind of gather it, pick it up, and take it home with you, and you're rich. And they didn't find that. They spent an awful lot of time looking for gold when they should have been trying to grow crops that would get them through the winter. So they had to learn a lesson a very difficult way. As you read in the textbook, every story is, one thing after another in terms of the hundreds of people that were lost with every expedition that they sent. The majority of those people ended up dying. They didn't even make it through the first year or two to even try to establish something that was going to be profitable. In terms of signaling when England really begins to truly challenge Spain for dominance in the world, most of the time we point to the Spanish Armada and the English defeat of that. This is the Spanish fleet that was considered to be pretty much invincible. They had the great navy in the world at this time, and the English ships, mostly because of strategy, they had smaller ships, they could maneuver better, and they lured them into areas where the Spanish ships could not turn and maneuver as easily, and England was able to defeat the majority of the Spanish fleet And that is where they begin, because if you don't have a fleet and you're trying to explore across the ocean, it's a little tough. Most of us can't swim that far. So this is the turning point from when, I don't know if you guys ever grew up playing King of the Hill on the playground, but, Spain was king of the hill for sure for pretty much the whole 1500s. And it's toward the end of the 1500s that England is able to begin to challenge them, and 1588 is sort of when they kind of knock them off the top of the hill and take their own place there. And then England is going to pretty much be the king of the hill for quite a while after that. So in terms of who has the dominance in the world, Spain definitely did in the 1500s. England is going to change that and change places with them into the 1600s. The next two things just talk about a couple failed attempts that England had. Newfoundland, where they tried to set up a colony, it didn't last, and the same thing with Roanoke. Roanoke apparently was there for 5 years, but when people left to go to England to get supplies and stuff and come back, when they got back, Roanoke had disappeared, and we're not exactly sure what happened. This is the one where there was...
Kronos on a tree.
Right.
Must have been an Indian word. They must have wanted to leave their mark to kind of sort of let the settlers know what happened. But
and that's what they think might have happened, is that the term was carved into the tree.
The word was a word that the settlers didn't understand.
Well, it was the name of an Indian tribe in the area, so they think that somebody might have carved that name into the tree to let people know that it was somehow... Now, were they saying that this Indian tribe killed us, or are they saying, this is where we are, come find us? Like that they've taken us to help us, but nobody ever was able to, as far as we know, to go find that Indian tribe to find out if they had taken the whites in and helped them, or if they had actually killed them. So that's why it's called the Lost Colony, because it was there for a while and then it disappeared. So, when I was a kid, my dad was a small-time stamp and coin dealer, and being, a stupid kid, I decided that stamps were prettier than coins, and so I started collecting stamps instead of the silver dollars that my dad collected and the gold coins that he collected. So all of that stuff got sold, and I still have the stamps, which are pretty and worthless. So that's why I stand here today teaching you instead of living on my yacht. But anyway, I still love stamps, to be honest with you, and especially U.S. stamps. The stamps today, we put out so many stamps today. I don't know if you guys are into stamps at all, but we put out hundreds of stamps every year. So it's almost not even fun to collect anymore because there's so many of them, you just can't keep up with them. But it used to be that the post office only put out about 20 stamps a year. And you have some stamps that are just little heads of men, famous guys that are usually bald and ugly. But then there's the commemorative ones that are some kind of a picture that commemorates some event in our history. And there was a stamp that was put out in, forget the year now, usually I remember it, but early 1900s that was a really pretty, I have it and I can't find it. I usually have it in this folder. But it's a real pretty pale blue color. It's a very unusual color for our stamp history. We don't have too many that are like that. And it's a picture of a English woman. You can tell that she's probably more of an aristocrat that's in nice clothing and stuff, and she's holding a baby. And that stamp commemorates Virginia Dare, the first little girl who was born in America, to John White's daughter, I believe. Yeah. And so, growing up as a kid, I remember collecting these stamps, and then I would look up what the stamp was supposed to be about, and it kind of helped, I don't know, it's one of the ways I think I got interested in history as a child, is by, through stamp collecting. I always like to think, this little girl, this little Virginia Dare, we could think that she was just slaughtered by Indians, Or we could think that she was one of the ones rescued by the Indian tribe and taken back to their tribe, and maybe she was raised and became the wife of a chief or something. And who knows, maybe we're all sitting here today and somehow have, the blood of Virginia Dare in us in some form or another. But all that through a little stamp that I collected as a kid. Anyway, that colony disappears, and that's kind of the first attempt that the English had at a colony. It wasn't successful. Jamestown is considered the first successful English colony. And again, I don't ask you guys to memorize a lot of dates, but there are some dates that I do want you to remember more because it sets the context for what we're talking about. Jamestown is it's Jamestown, but what state would this end up being?
Virginia.
Virginia, right? So 1607, we have Virginia established. Now, when we talk about the original English colonies, how many are there?
13.
13 is usually what we talk about, right?
Yeah.
So the original 13 English colonies are the ones who ended up revolting against the British Crown and having the American Revolution. I don't ask you to memorize all of them and their dates, but I do want you to remember the first and the 13th. So the first is Virginia, or Jamestown, in 1607. What's the last of the 13th?
Georgia.
In what year?
I don't know. I think it is.
After 1607.
1776
1607
maybe?
plus.
1607 plus,
There
right?
you go. Sometime.
After 1607. Okay, is it in the 1600s?
No, I don't know. I think it may be 1776.
No, that's too late, because that's the American Revolution.
1700?
1648.
Oh, 1733.
Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out to you, now when you get to be my age, this doesn't seem to be that far apart. At your age, that seems like a lot of years, right? How many years is there between the first and the 13th?
22.
126 years, right? So my point being, we tend to think of the original English colonies as people came over a few years, they settled in, they got really pissed off at the British, they decided we don't like you anymore, no more taxes, boom, we're going to shoot you, and now we're going to be independent. This is happening over a very long period of time. This is really back in this time period, at least 3 generations of people. The English colonies are being established, they're kind of getting their start. They're starting to develop their own sense of who they are because they're across the ocean from Great Britain.
Yeah.
So it isn't like all this happens in a very short period of time. The process of us getting from where the first Englishmen set up a permanent settlement to the point where we decide to finally revolt against Great Britain, and that's not even for another 40 years, 1776,
Yeah.
it's a very long period of time. And for most of this period of time, these people, and this is all the other 11 colonies in here, these people are very happy and proud to be considered British. They're not wanting to revolt. They're not wanting to be something different. They love the fact, because remember, this is when Britain is on their king of the hill. And they're part of that. We have this idea that Americans came here to get away from Great Britain, to get away from that horrible, terrible king and country and parliament, and they didn't want any part of that. That is absolutely not true. Nobody got on the boat and took off their English wig and said, great, don't have to wear that scratchy thing anymore. They still were very proud to be English. And it takes them a very long time to get from here to 1776 to where they say it's time for us to declare ourselves something different than English.
Yeah.
And that's a real important piece for you to remember in this class, because I feel like we come into American history, especially after elementary school, middle school, high school, thinking that they came here to get away from Great Britain. Now, going back to my example about my kids going away to college, there is a little piece of that. They came here to get away maybe from some of the aspects of Great Britain, especially those who came here for religious independence. They came here because they wanted to be able to practice their faith without having the government breathing down their neck or telling them what to do. The Quakers came here because of religious independence, but also because they were pacifists. What's a pacifist?
No violence.
Yeah, you don't believe in violence, you're not going to go to war, those kinds of things. That didn't go over real well with the King of England. He wanted you to, sign up for his service in his army. So they came here to get away from maybe certain aspects of Great Britain, where Great Britain wouldn't be able to hold them accountable in certain areas. But in terms of saying we no longer want to be English, that's not what's going on here.
Yeah.
And even when we do get to 1776, it takes them a long time to make that decision. There were more people who wanted to remain loyal to Great Britain than there were that wanted to leave. We'll talk more about that, obviously, in the next couple weeks. Often the American Revolution is referred to as a minority revolution. And I don't mean minority in the sense of, blacks or, a different group. I'm talking about minority in terms of numbers. Because a minority of people actually wanted the revolution.
Yeah.
They say that only 40% of Americans, and that's probably on the high side, actually wanted to break away from Great Britain. But they happen to be the 40% that had power and influence. So it ends up happening, even though if you really took a vote of all Americans, you probably wouldn't have gotten the majority of them to say, yes, let's go ahead and do this. So keep that in mind as we continue to move through looking at the settlement.
So is that why most of them didn't, like, especially the French, didn't bring women with them, or they weren't worried about planting or really starting their lives? They were just planning to come over, grab stuff and go?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I don't know that there's one answer to that. I think the French didn't come necessarily starting with the idea that they wanted to have permanent settlements here. It was more about finding what's here, establishing trade, possibly, just finding gold and silver like the Spanish did. And it was usually, if you're going to explore and you're talking about the dangers and risk involved in that, you don't bring women. So the men would come, and if they had found something that was more enticing in terms of a place to raise a family and things like that, maybe they would have gone back and brought their families over. But at this point, it's such a difficult life and a difficult way to even get yourself established. It's not really that appealing to bring families here. The English that did start to bring families, though, were the ones that were coming more for the religious reasons, because they wanted to get away to practice their faith, but they wanted to do that with their families. So the ones who came to Jamestown are different. That was more for profit, and those were mostly, to start with, just men looking for that gold and silver.
Because I believe they know they won't come back.
Right. If they.
That means I cannot leave my family behind.
Right. But until they felt like they could really make a go of it, most of them weren't willing to try to bring women over with them and actually think about the idea of starting a permanent settlement. But when it came to breaking away for religious reasons, that was kind of where it started to change in terms of, I'm leaving for my faith, and my faith includes, my wife and kids, and so we're all going to go together and see if we can make this work. And then obviously the whole faith thing, and God will take care of us if this is what we're supposed to do, and all that's involved in that as well. I'm not going to get into all the stuff regarding the struggles and the disease and the tension in the communities and things like that. I mean, all of that's in your book, and there's, like I said, story after story as to how difficult it was for most of these settlements to make a go of it. It took them years before they really started to feel like, okay, we're finally over the hump and we're going to be able to be successful. One of the key things is when they realized that they weren't going to find gold and silver is how do you make a living here? I mean, if we can't find that, how are we going to survive? And so for Virginia, what did that end up being?
Tobacco.
Tobacco, which wasn't used in Europe at this time. This was kind of a new thing that we introduced to the rest of the world. Great for Americans. We just imposed lung cancer on everybody in the world. But it does end up becoming a very popular product and does become the thing that Virginia can count on as a cash crop. I mean, you don't eat it, obviously. So you carry it back to Europe and sell it there, and that's how you make money to then be able to buy the things that you need and then bring them back from Europe to America, because we don't have much of a manufacturing segment here for quite a while. So coming upon tobacco and learning how to produce it in a way that is going to be in demand back in Europe and get it shipped over there, vice versa, all that kind of stuff, that's what really begins to give them something that they know that they can build a life around, an industry that they can build a life around. And one of the issues with tobacco is that it exhausts the soil so quickly. And they don't know all the things we know today about crop rotation and things like that, and leaving land fallow for periods of time so that you don't, destroy it as far as the nutrients. So they keep using the soil over and over again, and then the crops start to fail because there's not enough nutrients in the soil, so they have to move to a new area. But lo and behold, who's on the new area? Other Indians, right? So the Indians are now in their way, so that starts to have conflict, more conflict with the Indians. So the history of Virginia and Maryland, both of those communities, is a history of coming into constant conflict with Indians as they kept wanting more land. They'd make agreements with the Indians and then turn around and break the agreements because they needed more land, and they kept pushing the Indians back. So there's, again, quite a bit in your book about how we kept, we'd make some space, some peace with the Indians, there'd be some space, and then we'd end up, needing more land, pushing them back again, and that doesn't really end until we push them into the Pacific on the other side eventually, but we'll get to that too. The other thing is tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. And the people who bought this land are not necessarily people who want to work very hard. They want people to do the work for them. Again, one of the things that we grew up believing is that from the very beginning, it was blacks that were out there in the fields doing this work. That's not the case. African slavery does not really take hold in this country until the 1700s. I mean, we start to have some African slaves here in the 1600s, but really very few compared to the other laborers. The majority of people that are doing the work are whites, but they're poor whites. They're not aristocrats. And how did they get here?
They ask for a ride. They will work on the boat for just like a contract. We used to call them when they went from Europe to America. They used to call them 36 months or engaged. But in this one that you got, I've seen indentured something,
Right.
Servants.
Yeah, that's the term I've always known about, but
I used to see that before.
so what we're talking about, we refer to it as an indentured servant, because an indenture is like a contract, a commitment that you make for a period of time to work in exchange for something else. In this case, what you were exchanging was they would pay for your trip over to America. So it would get you here so that you would have the opportunity, hopefully, to make a life for yourself. But you had to first pay off that voyage by working, and the amount of time started at 7 years. Over time, it dropped down to more like probably an average of 4 years. So you would be committing to work for somebody for 4 years. And then after that period of time, they, depending on your contract, you sometimes just went free and got nothing. You put in your 4 years and now you have your freedom. Sometimes they gave you some clothing and some food. Sometimes they actually gave you a small piece of land. So obviously there's different contracts depending on who you're dealing with, but indentured servants, by and large, we're talking like the vast majority of them are white. And most of them are English, but there are other Europeans that get involved in this, but most of them are English. So you're bringing people over that speak the same language that you do. They know your culture and your community and everything, but they're the lower class for the most part. And they don't have the ability to ever pay for their way to get over here to America. So they're taking the chance that they'll survive the trip over and their years of service to then be able to have their own farm. Because most people back then, that's what you wanted, was to get a piece of land so that you could be successful. Land was the key to being able to make a life for yourself. And of course, grass is always greener on the other side. The stories you hear back in England about America make it sound like it's paradise. Wasn't always the case for people who got here. 40% of all indentured servants never made it through their period of indenture. So 4 out of every 10 who came died before they finished their term. And that's not even counting the number who died on the ships trying to get here. That's the ones who actually got here. 4 out of 10 would not make it through their period of indenture. It's a rough, rough life for these people. And even the aristocrats don't have it easy. This is not an easy place in the 1600s to survive, period. There is a lot of disease, especially in the South, because malaria is prevalent in the southern states, in these areas that we're talking about where the tobacco fields are. So even a white aristocrat, the average mortality of a white aristocrat was about 40 years of age. I would be long dead. And for a servant, your mortality was probably in the early 20s. So this is a rough place for everybody, not just for somebody who has to work that hard out in the fields.
So were families coming over indentured, or was it just like single adults?
Mostly single people, but because you couldn't necessarily guarantee that you could come over as a family and stay together. But it did happen. I mean, I've read about some stories of people attempting to do that, but a lot of times it was young men who came, and then when they began to realize there were not enough women for all the men they had brought over, they would round up women. I mean, there's one story that talks about 100 women on one ship that they brought over specifically to become the wives of Englishmen that were already here. And those weren't necessarily to marry other indentured servants. Those were to marry just Englishmen who were here. So it would be possibly a more upper class man, but he's going to take on a wife that probably came from the lower classes. Because most women aren't going to get on a boat and come over here back in the 1600s. Unless they're, single and have no other real options for their life. But it's difficult for everybody, especially in the South. People in the North, the New England states, the mortality was much higher. The average age of somebody living up in New England at this time was closer to 70. They don't have the same issues with disease that they do in the southern states. And it's the first time you start to see 3 generations in the same household, because the grandparents live long enough to see their grandchildren. In the South, they hardly ever ever meet a grandchild because they don't live long enough for a grandchild to be born. So you start to get a whole different community atmosphere and even a cultural atmosphere. It's almost like we have two different countries, up in New England versus the lower South, because it's really a very different world in which you live. And what you face in terms of, in the South they see death so much more often. Not just themselves, but even amongst their servants. The other thing that they develop in this period is the headright system, because again, it's not easy to get people to come here. This is really tough work, and there's a very good chance you're going to die before you even get here, because so many of them die on the voyage itself. So they begin to offer people what they call headrights, which are 50-acre land grants. If you could pay your own way here, they're going to give you 50 acres of land for free. If you already live here, but and you need servants, if you're willing to pay for somebody to come, we'll give you another 50 acres of land. So you already have your own farm, but now you can get 50 more acres of land for every person you bring over. So to entice people to come, they either gave them land or they gave land to the people here who would be willing to pay to bring those people over, because we just didn't have the laborers to do the work that needed to be done. And so, especially in Virginia and Maryland, this becomes very successful for them. In terms of, more people are willing to risk something like this if they know for sure that they're going to get something in return. And again, land is money back then. This is the way to build a life, is if you can get together especially several of these grants will give you a pretty decent farm. Another thing about Virginia, and this, the very top thing up there, the House of Burgesses. A burgess is just a citizen of a community. A burgher is the term that was used, not burger like hamburger, but B-U-R-G-H-E-R, I think. It's a European term for citizen or a person who's part of a community. So the Burgesses is, the House of Burgesses is the first time in English America that this new community, Jamestown, decided to have a representative assembly to make the rules for their particular community. So people were chosen, and they had to be landowners. You don't have an indentured servant that gets to sit on the House of Burgesses, because they want people that have a stake in the community, people that are landowners, that will sit in the House of Burgesses and discuss issues, present laws that they would like to have passed, and then vote on whether or not those laws are going to become in effect in their community. We so easily take that for granted, because that's what we've always done here as far as we know. But this is the first time that they do this in America. And it's like Parliament back in England, but not exactly like Parliament. Because Parliament back in England, without getting into a lot of English history, there's always the tension between the king and Parliament. Because the king is considered to be a divine ruler. He's been appointed by God to do that.
Yeah.
But over time, Parliament has decided that maybe God has made some mistakes. And the king isn't always the wisest person to make some of those decisions. So over quite a few years, England eventually developed this system of shared governance between Parliament and the king, or Parliament and the monarchy, whoever that might be. Sometimes it's a queen. But there's always this tension in England between who really has the most power. Is it the king or is it Parliament? And depending on which king you point to or which period in history, sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But it took them hundreds of years to get to that place, of that shared governance between those two bodies. So yes, they have representative government to a point, but when the king gets really ticked off at them, a lot of times he'll just shut them down and doesn't let them meet, and that's what happens in the 1600s, and you read about Charles getting his head cut off because Parliament finally got fed up with him and said, off with your head. So what they're doing here in America is they're saying, we're not going to have like one person in charge of our community. We're not going to have like a king here, because they already have a king back in England. They're still loyal to the King of England, but he's 3,000 miles away. So what do we do here? You know, in terms of making rules for our day-to-day life, how do we handle that? And so they decide to come up with this assembly that will make the decisions for their community. But those people get voted in, sort of. I mean, there's limitations on who can or can't do it, but they're chosen by the community itself. And what we're going to find is almost every American colony that's established begins to do this. They begin to set up some form of local government like this so that they can make decisions on the local level because England is too far away. And what that's going to evolve into is what we have today in this country. For good or for bad. I mean, I don't want to be anywhere else, but it doesn't always work. And part of the reason why it doesn't work, which we'll get into, is it works a whole lot better when you're talking a few hundred people in a community. Does anybody know what the population of America is today?
No.
I don't expect you to know the exact number, because it changes every like second, right?
Like 800 million?
What?
Is it like 800
No,
million?
it's not that much.
122 million?
Nobody? Any idea? Another good thing for you to know.
250 million.
313 million. 313 million. Okay, compared to China, not much, right? Compared to India, not much. But 313 million people, and we are trying to run this country by a democracy where every single person gets a say, even the stupid ones. I don't know about you, but when I go to a doctor, I want him to be the smartest person in the world.
Yeah.
Because he's going to make decisions about my health, right? Now, in America, we believe every person should have a say. But the ancient Greeks who developed the concept of democracy said, no, not a good idea. It needs to be the philosophers, which we don't really have philosophers today as much, but to them, you don't make those kinds of decisions for a community unless you're educated and experienced and mature and have made, have the background to be able to do these things. But here in America, we have this idea that every person should be able to make those decisions. Now, of course, we all know it doesn't just end up being everybody, because most of us don't really get to make much of a difference. But it ends up being the people who have the money, know the right people, that end up getting in positions of senators, congressmen, and everything else. And then most of the rest of us don't even really understand what's going on and how we could change anything and make a difference. I love the concept of what we do here. I honestly don't believe it can work effectively for 313 million people. So I don't know that I will live long enough for this to happen, but you guys will. So someday you're going to be sitting someplace and you're going to say, Dr. Dunn told us that America would eventually split into more than one country. And she was right. Because I don't see how we can continue to do this.
Continue to do what, was it?
We're not going to be able to continue to have a country this large and govern it effectively, and it will split apart. And I don't know if it'll split east and west, or north and south, or just Texas will go off by itself, because they're kind of...
It'll split by corporation.
about once the money is worthless, that's when it'll happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's technically an oligarchy right now, isn't it? It's just all run by rich and the people that have influence.
Yeah, did you say oligarchy? Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I actually think it's amazing that we are still living under the same government that we created over 200 years ago. That document, that constitution that we created has been able to be, I mean, it shows you the genius of that document. Because those guys had no idea what they were writing in terms of what they were going to encounter now. You know, they didn't know what our world was going to be like today. And yet it still works. Maybe not as well as it should, but it still works. And I think it still could work if we didn't have 313 million people. You know, you could still have as much land as we do, but if we didn't have that many people. But to try to govern in a way that actually meets the needs of all 313 million of us in the kind of world economy and interconnectedness and everything else we have, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, our economy's really bad. Mom thinks that, my mom says that we might have a socialist economy sometime soon in the near future, and she thinks that this government is eventually going to collapse.
Well, I don't know that it's going to collapse. I just think it's going to have to, I just wouldn't be surprised to see states break off and say, we can more effectively govern our region with our own federal government, central government, not being part of this larger thing that we call the United States of America. Which sounds like heresy, you know, for me to say that, right? But
That's how it all started. So.
I just, I'm going to start making my list of which ones I want to stay part and which ones I wouldn't mind if they went away. Just kidding. Anyway, just it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 20 years in many different areas. With Maryland, it originally started as a Catholic colony because land was given to somebody who was Catholic, but the problem was he couldn't get enough Catholics to come over, so he had to open it up for Protestants, and then ended up with more Protestants than Catholics, and then they had their own little kind of conflict going on in Maryland. Eventually, they just had to kind of agree to disagree because they needed the people. So, religion was important, but apparently not as important as money. So, and keep in mind, Catholics back in this time period, in America, they're persecuted throughout most of the country, especially in New England. They do not, it's funny because people came over here to practice their own faith freely, but they don't want to let anybody else practice theirs. So Jews and Catholics up in New England were persecuted. They were not considered, that they just felt that they would tear apart their own community. And most of us, when we think about the development of America, we remember the stories of pilgrims coming to America and having Thanksgiving with the Indians and how we all sat around saying kumbaya around the fireplace. And there were moments like that, but they didn't last very long. Eventually, even in New England, there ended up being quite a bit of tension between the English Puritans and the Indians. At first, they kind of admired the Indians, saw them as, they referred to them as like noble savages, but then they eventually just saw them as being savages and did not want them to have anything to do with their people, and so you end up with conflict amongst them. The French learned how to work with the Indians, I think truly developed an appreciation for them. The English never really had, the Spanish tried to enslave them and make them work for them. The French tried to actually be nice to them and develop a relationship. The English were more like, when you're a dog person and you just don't have any interest in cats, you may not hate them, but it's just like, I don't need them, they're cats, and vice versa. It's kind of like, no, they just need to go away someplace else. We don't need them. And so, for the most part, there wasn't not necessarily a hatred. It was just, as long as you just leave, everything's fine. We don't want to enslave you, but we also don't want you to be our neighbors. So, over time, with some of them anyway, it becomes more antagonistic than that. Especially when they wanted their land and the Indians didn't just, pack their bags and leave for them. I have to be honest with you, this whole chapter regarding English colonization, for the most part, just doesn't interest me. There's certain aspects that do, but the whole story of, this Indian tribe did this and this English person, I don't care. But Rhode Island. We in this country to this day still talk and we believe very strongly in the separation of church and state, right? When I was growing up and going to school, we could pray in school. And then while I think I was in high school, they passed a law that was no longer allowed. Like a teacher couldn't lead the class in prayer. Like you hear some tragedy and the teacher, it used to be we would bow our heads and say a little prayer for whoever it was that had been hurt or something like that. Well, you can no longer do that. I mean, a person could lose their job for doing something like that. So you guys have grown up in a day and age where that's just the norm. We all believe and understand about the separation of church and state. Why is it important to us to hold that line and to keep church and state separated?
I think
Freedom
it's
of religion?
Yeah, I think it's because of the freedom of religion.
Okay, so both of you are saying freedom of religion. What do you mean by that?
Well, because there's so many different religions. Some people do believe, some people believe this, they believe that, you know what I'm saying? So I think that if we just put everything under one umbrella, not everybody's going to believe in that, and they wanted to make sure that
So who would be putting us all under one umbrella? The government. So we don't want the government to impose upon us what we can believe or not believe, okay?
Because
So-
what's interesting is, I went to German schools until 6th grade. I didn't get to American schools until later on in my 6th grade. But in Germany, you still mandatorily take religious classes. And it's weird, because I grew up with that, and still, I asked my dad, still to this day, they do it. And then when I started American school, they said, oh, no, they don't do that.
Okay, so we don't want the government to tell us how to worship or what to believe. What would be another reason for separation of church and state?
Conflict.
In order to fairly run a government without any kind of issues, you can't take one group over another. You have to lay out a set of laws that won't give favor to one group over the other, or won't take certain things into account. It has to be an equal, fair government.
So as to have, are you still talking about that all religions will be treated equally?
No, they're just not taking religion into account at all. Like just looking at purely for the sake of running the government and for the good of the people without any religious thought whatsoever. You can't bring religion into the conversation at all. You have to just purely think about what's good for the country or the city or wherever you're at.
So more equal government than equal religion.
Yeah. But those are two very different things, right? What were you going to say, Princess?
Not giving the church too much power.
Okay, so that would fit over here, right? Or religion, I mean, church is, what do we mean by that exactly, but I know what you're saying. Anything else?
Wouldn't freedom of religion how do you say this? Convince more people to come over here? Because most places they come from, they're under a rule like the Catholic Church or.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think that having freedom of religion definitely enticed more people to come here, because most people back then would have said that they held to some kind of a faith, regardless of whether it was Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or whatever, and to be able to come someplace and not have the government tell them how to believe, I think was very enticing in this time period. I mean, today, it's not, I mean, it is important for some people, but it's not as prevalent around the world that people are trying to force you into a particular belief system. In some places it is, but not like it used to be. Now, in terms of these two things, today, which do you think is most important to your average person? As an American, is it more important to you to have the freedom to worship the way you want, or to make sure that religion is not going to influence your laws?
The religion is
To me, it's, those two are basically the same thing.
Now, this one is saying you can believe what you want, but it's not necessarily limiting that in saying that you can't let this affect this. This is saying religion cannot be part of our governmental decisions. So in America, what are we more concerned about
I'm
today?
more concerned myself with the freedom of religion.
What about the majority of Americans?
I think the majority of Americans, they're more worried about government being, you know, in their own category away from religion, so that they can look at a complete picture without having undue influence.
Is anybody in here over the age of 40 besides me? Well, you're still probably too young to remember this. I grew up in the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s. And I spent my first year of college at Liberty Baptist College. Has anybody ever heard of that? Does anybody know who was the founder of that college? His name was Jerry Falwell. I think he's passed away now. Do you remember the name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jerry Falwell in the 70s he's kind of like a TV evangelist, but he was actually a pretty good guy. He wasn't one of the ones who was a TV evangelist and then having sex with a secretary on the side, at least not as far as I have ever found out. But he started Liberty Baptist College, and his whole thing was about he's going to raise champions for Christ. And when I went there, he was at the height of his popularity, and there was a church that he was the minister of, and then the school was associated with that church. And then if you went to school there, you had to go to his church, and you had to go. I mean, you didn't have a choice. You had to go every Sunday. And we had all kinds of rules. Our curfew was at 10:30. You had to have lights out at 11. Girls had to wear a dress every day. I haven't worn a dress in 20 years. If you were dating somebody, you could not go out on a date with a person by yourself. You had to be chaperoned. Or if you were a senior, you could double date, but it always had to be with another couple that was also seniors. There was no public display of affection. When you sat in church or anywhere you went, you had to be at least 6 inches apart from whoever you were dating. If you were caught having sex while you were there, you were thrown out of school. There was no drinking, no smoking. We weren't allowed to go to R-rated movies.
Wow.
Couldn't cuss, obviously, just all kinds of rules. Okay, and that's where I went my freshman year of college, because I was going to be a champion for Christ and was planning to be a missionary and all that kind of stuff. But during that, in the 70s, Jerry Falwell started a political movement called the Moral Majority that was pushing for, one of the big issues then, I mean it's still an issue today, but it was a huge issue in the 70s, was abortion. Because I forget, when was Roe versus Wade? Yeah, I was going to say 72, 73, something like that. So this was right around the time of the Roe versus Wade decision. So huge movement to try to get that changed, overturned, or whatever, because it had passed and now we were trying to overturn it again. And so anyway, that was a lot of what the movement was about, and it was about other things too, but it was really about trying to really get Americans to, again, be concerned about morality and living, your life right and making good decisions and things like that. So they were called the moral majority, and you joined the group, you signed up on, well, it wasn't online back then, but you signed up by telephone, and there was billboards everywhere that had like, moral majority, and it had like a little box, like a check mark box to say, yes, I want to be part of that group. And so at that point in time, the idea was we need religion to have more influence on our government, because our government is going to do things that are immoral if we don't have religion influencing the decisions they make. So we want to elect people that are going to have a strong belief in God and the beliefs that we want them to have, so that they will vote accordingly, right? So you don't hear much of that anymore, because we've moved a long way away from that. And if people start talking that way, you get a lot of people really nervous about religion trying to have too much influence on the government. So today, I think, some of this is still true. I don't think any of us would want a government that tells us we can't believe something, or that we have to believe a particular way. Freedom of religion is important to us, but when we talk about separation of church and state, I would say the majority of Americans are really more concerned about, they don't want any particular religion or group of people trying to tell the government what is moral or immoral, which is exactly what was happening back in the 70s with this whole moral majority thing. Now, it's a very important concept for us. This is something that is important to us as Americans to this day. It was first talked about in the 1600s with Roger Williams in Rhode Island. He started Rhode Island as a community, as a colony, because he broke away from Massachusetts because he didn't believe in some of the things they were teaching. But his big thing about separation of church and state was he wasn't worried about religion influencing the government, which is our big concern today. What was he worried about?
Corruption of the secular world.
Which means?
Government influencing religion.
What?
Government influencing
Yeah.
religion.
His big reason for having separation of church and state is he doesn't want the government screwing up his church. We have completely flipped the coin. He was so concerned that if you don't have separation of church and state, that the government is going to somehow corrupt, that's what she was getting at, corrupt his church. That secular world, that world that's outside of the faith, is going to corrupt what we do here. That's why you need to have them completely separated. But we now are more concerned the other way. We're afraid that religion is going to corrupt our government. Now, the fact of the matter is, it's probably best both ways, right? Separate them, and then the government can't mess up your church, and the church can't mess up your government. They're just completely separate realms. But when people talk today, I've heard the argument when people will talk about separation of church and state, and people say, we've believed in separation of church and state since the very beginning of our, this country, going all the way back to Roger Williams in Rhode Island. Absolutely true. But not for the same reasons. If Roger Williams stood here today, he'd be like, that's not what I meant. That's not what I was concerned about. You guys are concerned that my religion is going to mess up your government. What I was concerned about is your government was going to mess up my religion. So the concept's still there, still important, but for completely different reasons. I come from obviously very, very religious background. And I get into conversations sometimes when I go home with my cousins, and they say the stupidest things. And I used to say them too. And I hear it come out of their mouth and I think, oh my God, was I really that ignorant? I remember taking astronomy as a freshman and going on and on. I mean, arguing every day. I was one of those students that fought every day with my teacher about evolution. Now, let me just say, I don't necessarily believe in evolution the way it's taught today, because I still believe in God, and I still believe God created this world. But I think there's a way to mesh the two. There can be an evolutionary process and still be a God. And that's, kind of how I've sort of reconciled the two. But back then, it was, oh no, I knew exactly how old the world was. I knew exactly what year the world was created by God. And I told him every day. I can't believe he didn't just shoot me one day.
If he had, he'd have been exiled for murder.
I don't know. I think the students would have backed him up. The students would have said, no, she did it. It's her fault. He had every right to do what he did. Anyway. There is some truth to the fact that wisdom does come with age. Sometimes a lot of it comes with age and sometimes not too much, but usually there's a little bit that comes with age. All right, is there anything?
Could women be landowners at the time?
Only if their husband died and they inherited, because of, like, if their father died and they were the only person that could inherit, or if their husband died. But generally speaking, a woman could not be involved in a land transaction. But a lot of women did end up owning land because men did die, especially in the South. So yeah. Now, in terms of African slavery, we talked about this a little bit last week, but the connection, and this, it was in your textbook as well, but most African slaves ended up in North America via the Caribbean, not from Africa. The majority of them were brought to the Caribbean and then were sold by landowners there to North America. So they're still African slaves because they originally came from Africa, but not directly from Africa. Because we had the connection, we meaning North America, had the connection with the Caribbean, especially as England developed colonies there. Barbados in particular there became a very strong connection between Barbados and the Carolina colony. Carolina was one colony to begin with and then split into North and South later. So there's a strong connection between Barbados and Carolina. Carolina grew rice, sent it to Barbados to feed the slaves, and then slaves came from Barbados to Carolina to work here. Quakers end up in Pennsylvania because William Penn was given a land grant. He wanted a haven for the Quakers because they really were persecuted. They're a strange group. Strange meaning unique, different, not, I mean, every religion is strange in their own way, but they were definitely very unique compared to the religions around them. So people didn't know what to do with them. And because they were pacifists, because they didn't believe in paying taxes, which that's going to get you in a lot of trouble. Anyway, so they ended up coming to Pennsylvania, and that's kind of how that colony was established. Most of you probably are aware that New York originally was settled by the Dutch, and then eventually England was able to take it over, but a lot of Dutch still lived there. So that's one of the reasons why New York is still so diverse, because you had a lot of different European people come to New York. Some of these other colonies get set up as they break off from an original colony, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that stuff. Georgia, we already talked about, is being established in 1733. One of the funny things about Georgia is it's established to create a buffer between the English colonies and Spanish Florida. So Oglethorpe was able to get the king to agree to allow him to bring people from prison there. Mainly debtors. People got thrown in jail if they were in debt and didn't pay their bills. It's kind of a scary thought. How many of us would be in jail, you know? My son would be there forever. You know, because it's one thing to be in debt as long as you're keeping up with your payments, but these are people who had missed payments, and so they throw them in jail. How does that solve any problem? You throw them in jail, how are they going to make money to pay their debts? It doesn't really make sense. But anyway, so Oglethorpe got permission to bring those people here because the king's like, sure, they're just criminals or debtors or whatever, and if they get attacked, kill them. At least they're not killing the good people, right? So it's a buffer, a military buffer between Spanish Florida and the rest of the English colonies. They tried some things there. It was kind of like a social experiment, like we bring them here and we can like reform them all and make them good little Christians and stuff. It didn't work, as we all know. But kind of an interesting reason to set it up. Mercantilism. Let me spend just the last 2 minutes talking about that for a second. The concept of mercantilism, it's basically an economic philosophy of the time period. And the idea was that in order for a country to become wealthy and to become successful, they always had to be exporting more than they import. Makes sense, right? I sell more than I buy. That's kind of the basic idea behind it. But they also had the thought that if another nation was making money, then that meant they were losing money. Because they have this idea that there's only a certain amount of wealth in the world. And so if you're getting wealthy at all or making any money, you're taking wealth that I could have. So there's tremendous competition involved in mercantilism, especially amongst the European powers of this time. And so they're always kind of fighting over trade routes and who has control of the African slave trade and who has control over certain like spice runs and things like that. So there's always this competition where they feel like they have to get the edge on the other nation. Another piece of this is that they believed very much in having colonies, because the more colonies you had, the more opportunity you had to bring more wealth into your country. Because colonies did two things for you. Generally speaking, there's probably some kind of raw materials there that you can get from them. You know, something that that colony has that you don't have enough of, so they're going to provide you with raw materials. But then, once you produce things, they're going to become the market to buy the things you produce. So they become the supplier of raw materials, but also the market to purchase your finished goods. And so England looks at America in that way. In their minds, and this is the piece I think a lot of times my students just like, you know, they think that England formed these colonies for the colonies to be successful. Like they want the colonies to be successful because they think all the people there are so wonderful. And they're like, oh, but they're such nice people, we really want them to do well. No, they didn't care about the people, they cared about making money. So the colonies, the phrase I like to use is the colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. It's all about the mother country benefiting from what the colonies can do for them. Now, if in the midst of all of that, the colonies themselves do well and they're able to be successful, that's okay too. But for the most part, it's about the mother country, and is the mother country going to be able to be successful and gain something from having these colonies? So when you think of mercantilism, that's kind of the gist of it. They exist for the benefit of the mother country. They're to produce raw materials for them, and then they're to become the market to buy their goods on the other end. And if you think of that, when we get into next week and the week after, it makes more sense why there would start to be conflict between Great Britain and the colonies that they established, because what they both want is going to kind of go in different directions. You know, at first it seems like they're going in the same direction, but it's going to start to split. And the Americans are going to want more than to just be something that benefits Great Britain. All right, so next week you have a discussion board. You have a quiz that's going to come available over chapters 1 and 2 that you need to take before you come to class next week.
So,
Yes.
just a few questions about the quiz. Do we take it whenever we find it? Because I've heard people check on it too. And is there a lot of names and dates and stuff, or was just all what happened?
It's the list of terms that you have for chapters 1 and 2. If you kind of during the week, just email me and I'll try to get back to you. Jennifer? You feeling? You sound like you might have a cold.
A little bit.
Yeah, hope you feel better.
Thanks.
Your discussion boards are just always open, right? I looked at them and
Yeah, I just don't
Okay.
bother to like have them,
that's cool because I'm going on a cruise, not next week, but the week after, so.
yeah.
just
Yeah, you
go
can
ahead and
get
do
ahead
that.
on
Okay.
it, so, yeah. All right. See you.
Oh, I don't know if I can mark them as
I just-
absent or late.